ordained in the Presbyterian Church, but since joined the Anglican Communion in this new placement at Cathedral Church of the Advent in Birmingham. Zac has written this book that just came out called The Worship Pastor, a call to ministry for worship leaders and teams. And I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into, and we're going to discuss together in a moment. I think it's a really, really helpful resource. And good news, if you'd like to get one of your own, and you can maybe even get it like autographed by the author. Zac brought some books with him, which is like a dying art. It's not really done that much anymore. We're thankful. So if you'd like to get a real book, see Zac after our time. But would you join me in a hand clap of appreciation and welcome for Zac? So Zac, come on up. Hopefully don't run out of water. Yeah, we've got water on water up here. We might have to. So we want to talk about the book together, and what struck me in reading this book and why I think it stands out among lots of other texts in kind of the world of writing about worship ministry or the role of the worship leader is that Zac starts out with the very maybe surprisingly controversial claim that worship leaders are actually pastoring their congregations as they lead worship. I know, it's shocking. I'll just read just a line that struck me as I was going. Zac notes that this is a bit of a shock to the system for some folks in the evangelical world. He writes, "We're living in a time of Western evangelicalism when our default assumption is that every church has two key offices, that of pastor and rock star." I thought that summed up our world a good bit. But I just want to kind of lead out with this question, Zac, that can kind of help give us a sense of where you're coming from, your overall perspective for the book. Why is it that the pastor and the rock star, as those key offices, why is that insufficient from your perspective?
I think ultimately it's not what the Bible describes as the leadership of the church being. And it's ultimately insufficient because the rock star isn't a clearly definable role. And I mean, that term's kind of used in a cheeky way, but musical leadership in a church, historically in the church, but also just biblically, has always been subsumed in a biblical understanding under some kind of pastoral role, whether that's people who are writing church music. If you study music history, honestly, you're studying church history. At least for Western European music history, you're studying church history. And the first sort of birth of Western music was out of the church. It was from people who thought as ministers, whether they were monks or whether they were bishops or whether they were just really clued in lay people. They thought pastorally about what they did. Even before that, and the people who were writing songs for the church in the Old Testament were out of the tribe of Levi. The people called out to be the priests of their people that God called out. And so I think it's actually quite a new thing that we would have a role in a church, in church leadership of the people of God, where that musical leadership, the person doesn't think of themselves necessarily in a pastoral manner.
That's helpful. I do kind of have to say at the outset, after meeting you this morning, that you are far, far too young.
You expected me to be?
Yeah.
What did you expect me to be?
I don't know. But reading the book, I found it very thoughtful and considered and, dare say, wise at terms. And you're way too young to be right. I don't know how this happens. Can you tell us kind of where the book came from? How did this thing come about?
Well, what's so funny is that what you're just talking about, Tim Keller, I don't know where I heard it. It's probably amongst the Tim Keller lore. But one of the things he said, the sort of Yoda-ish things that he said, is nobody should write a book before the age of 50. And when I heard that, I said, I'm going to commit to that. You know, I'm going to make a vow before the Lord. Right? Vows are made to be broken. I heard that. I really took that seriously. I thought there's something to that. And if I'm ever called by God to write one, I don't think it'll be Carlos. See, man. If I'm ever called to be that, I don't think that it's going to happen before then. What started happening was, so to backtrack and pause that thought, I just started leading worship in local churches, all the while knowing that I was going to be a pastor. And I felt called at an early age in high school toward pastoral ministry. And my vision of that was what my church gave me, which is preaching, teaching, visiting people in hospitals, kind of classical pastoral work. And then when I got to college, I knew I was going to go to seminary, didn't know what I was going to study in undergrad, and God just steered me in a musical direction. It was a musical gift, so I studied music. And as a result, even when I went to seminary, the jobs that were easy to get were church music jobs. So I started serving in the church plant. And I mean, it could be that I was part of the first generation of people who could have grown up in the contemporary church. You know, as all that stuff was shifting in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You know, it's my generation and younger that was conceivably the first to have that as their only vision for what worship was this sort of upfront rocker, you know, leading other people and singing rock songs to Jesus. And so that's an appealing, you know, especially when you think, gosh, there's a lot of emotional weight around this, and people seem to really like it. And so there was this vision before me that I had as the default vision for what this is. Somewhere along the journey of actually leading people in worship over the next 5 to 10 years, I started becoming haunted, and others my age, as we would dialogue about this stuff, and I started reading the Bible and going to seminary, studying Scripture, being haunted by the fact that the songs I was leading, the prayers I was praying, the services I was putting together, they were having a spiritual impact on the journeys of people in such a way where I felt like I need to take this a lot more seriously than I have been. I can't play around with this or think so little of what I'm doing here. And I started asking the why question. Why did I even get to the place where a church would hire me with this vision for what I'm supposed to be doing? Especially when I realized that whether I'm acknowledging it or not, what I'm doing is having a pastoral impact on people. So, whether you're hung up on the word pastor because maybe your tradition or denomination only reserves that for ordained people or whatever, I'm less concerned about. I'm more concerned about the fact that what we do has pastoral impact, whether we know it or not. It's just going to. And the question is, are we going to do that faithfully or unfaithfully? It's not a question of if. It really is a question of whether, it's a question of you're doing it. You're doing it. So are you going to do it intentionally or are you going to do it haphazardly? And that started getting me reflecting on all this stuff. And I just started keeping notes on it, stuff I'd read from other great worship scholars, things. And it was almost like vocational reflection. It was a way to continue in discovery of my vocation, which evidently is this sort of model of helping people be pastored through worship services in particular. And it was the discovery of this vocation and taking notes and reflecting on it and reading and dialoguing with others that I started formulating a kind of outline informally, such that I would get calls from other ministers who were like, hey, I've heard about you, I read your blog, or we were at a denominational meeting and you were leading music and I really appreciate the way that you led and the sort of what you did. We want a worship leader like that. And I would get more and more of those calls, and I said, well, I don't know where they are yet. I want to be a part of maybe training them up. But here are my notes. This is like my 40 pages of notes I've taken over the course of 4 years. Well, I send these notes to one pastor, and he says, the insights that you have here are too valuable. Like, why aren't you sharing them with the world? Why aren't you writing a book? I said, well, Tim Keller said. And he basically just said, it's a good rule. And he was charismatic enough to say, I think maybe the Holy Spirit might be wanting you to write this book now. Because there's a lot of ministers like me and churches like our church, this pastor was saying, that this would be a timely word for where evangelicalism is at, where we're at. And it felt like a divine moment. And so I said, okay, sorry, Tim. And I wrote it. And God, just the timing of it, God lined it up, and it was obvious that the wind was at my back for this. That's how it came.
Yeah, if we think about the vocation of the rock star, that's it's simple. It might not be easy, but it's simple, right? You gotta rock hard, right? I think that's what they tell me. But the vocation of the worship pastor is probably not simple or easy. And to blend what you're trying to do, to think about the ministry of a worship pastor as not only pastoral and shepherding the spiritual lives, but also teaching and having a theological component and having a formative effect, because it's happening through liturgy, through music, through structures, and affecting people's senses. That is all very, very complicated.
Right.
So here's just a couple of things I appreciate about the book. There's not a lot of books out there, I would assume, in the world of worship ministry that have the kind of footnotes that we've got here. Ooh, I love it. I mean, so there's biblical theology, systematic theology, church history, all kinds of, so I'm kind of geeking out on the footnotes a little bit as I was going through and just putting check marks and you can get that book, So I appreciate, you're kind of paying homage to the spirit of what Keller was saying, and that you are, building on the work of others. But I think probably the most helpful thing is the 16 different images or identifying roles of the worship pastor. So it's almost as if you're saying the ministry of the worship pastor is like this jewel or this, gemstone or something. You hold it up to the light and the light reflects through all these different angles. So the worship pastor has to be a churchman, a war general, a watchful prophet, a missionary, a caregiver, a curator, a tour guide. So what I thought we'd do is kind of dig in on a couple of these. So one that I think would be real helpful for our context is worship pastor as theological dietitian. So I love your word choices in some of these really interesting images, but the worship pastor as theological dietitian. So I just want to give you a little flavor of that, of what Zac writes there, so you get a sense of what he's talking about. Zac writes, so while it's unfair to place the weight of catechesis, that is, education and training in the church, squarely on the shoulders of the weekly service, at the same time we need to recognize that gathered worship, not the classroom, is often ground zero, where the Word of God forms every believer's theology. Learning theology is not just a heady exercise of fact memorization. It's an integrated way of knowing and being known by God. And worship is the context where primary theology takes place, where we are theologized. Talk a little bit about how that's kind of played out in your own experience.
Yeah. I mean, I learned systematic theology the traditional way. It was through Wayne Grudem's systematic theology. That was my first systematics text in college, because some of his recent PhD students had come out to Biola to be theology profs there, and that it lit my fire. It ignited me. One of the things that it actually provided for me was the tethering between worship and theology, because at the end of every chapter there's a hymn. And so it was almost teaching you there's a connection between the songs that we sing and the scriptures and its truths, right? But that perspective also, I didn't start realizing just how much people are formed and shaped theologically as affective beings until I started reading Augustine and James K.A. Smith digesting Augustine for us in the way that liturgy or just a service and its structure shapes people. And then that got me into some realms of reading some people outside my own traditions who all the while, outside of evangelicalism, had writing about this concept of liturgical theology. people who think much more formatively about this stuff than most of us evangelicals who are writing about it. And starting to read that stuff got me into places that gave me distinctions in categories like primary theology and secondary theology, which is something that you hear if you read a lot of liturgical theology books. And what they'll say is secondary theology, which doesn't make it less important. Secondary theology is actually that theology that I was talking about. It's textbook theology, it's classroom theology. It's what you learn outside the context of the lived life of the church. Primary theology is the on-the-ground interaction, knowing God and being known by Him. And chiefly for the church, it's in the corporate gathering of the people of God. That's where it's most distilled. And the point is, there's a symbiotic relationship between primary and secondary theology. Primary theology is where that stuff happens, where people are shaped. Secondary theology is reflection on that constantly. And the dialogue between those two things is the sort of rich theological life of the church. And so that sort of began the chapter in a way of saying that even as we plan songs and lead prayers, we're contributing to the theological makeup of our people. We're actually making some kind of theologian out of every believer who is worshiping there. And then I go into the metaphor of a dietitian, which isn't my own. And I would say like 90% of my book really isn't new thought. It's just distilled thoughts of other people. I really feel like there's only a little bit that's pressing into original material for me. And I'm kind of scared about that one. That's emotional shepherd. That's stuff where I feel like I'm saying stuff I haven't heard anybody else say yet. And I'm taking different people and pushing the conversation a little further. But for theological dietitian, that's from a guy up the road named John Whitfleet, who talked a lot about how we plan the pastoral nature of worship planning and leading is very much in a dietary metaphor. And I love that metaphor. It gets teased out in tons of ways in the way that we can think about worship planning weekly and monthly and annually, vis-a-vis the Psalms and the Scriptures and how those two interact.
Yeah, notions of feasting and fasting and a balanced diet, all would kind of play in there. You do have this one caution that I just invite you to kind of flesh out here. The caution of old Adam's comfort food. Can you tell us what that's all about?
Yeah, I mean, if you're on the ground like me in a local church, you don't get to sit in a laboratory like this and hang on to your ideals. If you do, you will be crucified and out of a job. That's just the way it works. Like, so you have we go to seminary, or we're in a university setting, and we learn sort of the ideals. And then we go serve in a local church where people can't handle all those ideals. They aren't ready for them. And there's the gap between the sort of ideal and reality and where the church is at. And depending on how big that gap is, you've got a vision. All of a sudden, the distance between that is the vision God has placed on your heart to move the church from here to here, or more precisely, seek the Lord's moving of the church from there to there. And so one of the things that I try to say is, as a dietitian, we want to give people the best food possible. But every dietitian knows if I have a client who's unhealthy, and I want them to eat more healthily, and they've been eating unhealthily, I can't just give them a diet of kale and quinoa and all the wonderful things. Number one, because actually their body will probably reject it. It's just not used to that food. Number two, they won't like it and they won't stick with it. They can't endure. So they'll fire me. I'll be gone. I think there's an actual on-the-ground truth for what it means to pastor theological health into a congregation, which is I can't just give them everything that sort of seminary taught me I must give them. It needs to be given in sort of stages. And maybe it is that the truth needs to be wrapped in a little bit of their comfort food, Like for instance, there's this new worship song out there, relatively recent, many of you probably heard, called Reckless Love, right? Total firestorm debate. Is God's love reckless? Is this theologically accurate? Can we say these kinds of things? Meanwhile, people on the ground, have their parishioners hear this song on the radio and find themselves deeply moved, number one, find themselves connecting with God and renewed. And they come to you, worship leader, who would never want to talk theologically about God's reckless love because God is not reckless, and come to you and say, can I sing this song with puppy dog eyes, And my response is no, because that's not theologically totally accurate. But they're saying, but it actually, I read the scriptures and it sort of helped me to engage with God a little better. And is it really theologically wrong? She's like, well, no, it's just not theologically the best. It's an anthropomorphic language. It's not the way we want to talk about. I can spout off the ivory tower at them all day long, or I can listen to their heart and recognize, okay, what if I surrounded reckless love with a lot of good sort of liturgical pieces, and or the appropriate structure of the liturgy to make that have almost the right meaning, so that they're inclined based on the sort of theological content of the whole to rightly interpret what reckless love does and does not mean. Maybe for some of you just think reckless is the wrong word. I don't. I happen to think it's a poetic way of describing a very real way that God describes himself. Parable of the prodigal son, the way the father recklessly runs to the son, right? So I think it's an acceptable metaphor. I'm not totally opposed to it, but yes, it can be taken a variety of ways. So that's where I surround that comfort food with some theological kale and quinoa. Fortifies it. They swallow it. They swallow the kale easier because I've actually pastorally engaged something that goes right to their heart, And then I talk about particular. There's one comfort food though that we really should avoid like the plague, and I call it the high fructose corn syrup of worship. And it's the comfort food that by and large ends up being cancerous to the gospel-bearing fruit in the life of the believer. And that comfort food really is a ton of singing about who we are and what we've done for God. A lot of the language of consecration, which in its right posture is in the Psalms. But when we fill our worship language with Jesus, I'm living for your name. Jesus, I'm never going to do this because I'm fixed on you. I give it all away to you, God. I surrender everything to you. And that's kind of like the high fructose corn syrup, the sort of anti-gospel. Why? Because it's putting the onus of faith and growth on our commitment to God and not God's commitment to us in Jesus Christ. And so I think it actually tickles the ears of the old Adam, the flesh in us, to sing a lot of that kind of stuff. Again, liturgically, right in the right spot. After we've sung of the gospel and Christ's work, it's wonderful maybe at the end of a service or during the offering to say, God, in response to your great love, I surrender. I give it all to you. But what I found is that this kind of stuff is all over, kind of killing our ability to receive the nutrients of the gospel in a worship service. So that's what I describe as old Adam's comfort food. New Adam's feast being, let's replace that with so much more singing about Christ and his work for us, his finished work for us.
It's getting good. Getting interesting now, for sure. I should also say our conversation today brought to you by the Kale Farmers Union. So, because you talked about structure and we've got these cool slides, I thought let's do that for just a minute. So one of the other another of the many images that Zac offers is worship pastor as a liturgical architect.
And again, it's not my image; it's Constant Cherry. So I'm a borrower and I steal everything.
You don't have to say definitely got my attention because I was like at one time an architecture student myself, so I feel you. But thinking about the service as a built form, as a almost kind of a liturgical environment. Okay, so I'm gonna hit this slide. Can you talk about structure?
Yeah.
So is this the right one to bring?
Sure, that's a good one.
Okay.
So one of the many books that was sort of made deep impressions on me theologically and pragmatically was Brian Chappell's Christ-Centered Worship. I don't know if any of you read it, but what he does is in a lot of the traditions of the church across various spheres of Christianity, he traces common threads about how historically they have structured worship. And one of the claims he makes after going through these various traditions is worship looks really different in these traditions, and yet there are some common themes of the way this service is structured. And he says, ultimately, this common theme is the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In a way that a worship service is, in all these traditions, is a recapitulation of the narrative of Scripture. Some people call it creation, fall, redemption, consummation. Other people call it, confession, absolution, offering, those kinds of things. But there's always this similar structure, and it's telling the story of the gospel, of our sin, our need of a Savior, of God's provision of a Savior, and our responsive response to God's provision. This structure, this gospel-shaped structure, is something that I've seen people use in all sorts of contexts to be faithful to this liturgy, to be faithful to this architecture. And one of the things I wanted to do in Liturgical Architect was say, part of the problem that people have with liturgy who come from more free church or charismatic traditions is that it's so stutter-step and devoid of kind of what I would describe positively as emotional flow. Something where you feel like you're actually journeying through a story from beginning to end without starting and stopping. I mean, if you came to my church on a Sunday morning, which is like choir and organ and a really traditional prayer book liturgy, especially if you're from a charismatic tradition, you totally feel that way. You feel like, I can't connect to this because I'm up and I'm down and I'm saying stuff, and then the choir's saying things to me and I'm saying things to the choir, and I don't get any of this, right? And I just feel like I want to get into this, but it has no flow. Like, that's the big sort of charismatic accusation. And I take that seriously. I think there's something to it. And so how does one think about, if you're trying to be faithful to the Bible and to the church's understanding of the Bible as it speaks to this structure of worship, if you're trying to be faithful to that and yet faithful to the values of your tradition, and maybe your tradition really does value this flow, like this kind of seamless sense of, I enter in and I don't really exit until the benediction. I don't exit until service is over. How do you be faithful to that? And so what I was trying to do in Liturgical Architect was say, I think there's a way. I think there's a way for everybody to reflect on how to be more faithful to the biblical vision for a Christ-centered, gospel-shaped worship service from a variety of traditions. And so what I try to do is break it down to its kind of most common themes. There's sort of three sections, I say, of what might, and sort of distilling Bryan Chapel. We want to have an experience of the glory of God. That glory of God, if we're being honest as human beings, just the natural human reaction to the glory of God is like Isaiah, in Isaiah 6, where it's, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among the people of unclean lips. The natural, if you're really experiencing the glory of God, what every last one of us instinctively must do is confess our sin and our unworthiness to be in His presence. It's something very natural. And we're kind of stuck there, apart from God's provision of something, a fiery coal from heaven, Jesus Christ, our atonement. And so this is the story of sin and salvation, creation and the glory of God, the fall of humanity, and then God's provision of redemption through Jesus Christ our Lord, and the church being sent out as a result, equipped on mission. And so what I say is there's three broad categories that I think describe and define in a broad sense what the Scriptures give us as a biblical shape of a worship service centered around the person and work of Christ in relationship to us. So these are the kinds of things that we go through. And this is from the Emotional Shepherd chapter. So I try to set up this diagram as a way of saying, if we were talking about emotional flow of a worship service, this would be the kind of contour. We feel the bright emotions up top, and we feel the dark emotions. If we were not only sort of moving through this theologically, but experiencing this emotionally, this is how it might look. It would look like this sort of pattern. And I said, what would it look like for a church that really prizes flow to do this? So I started teasing out, hey, this is how it might look if you're this kind of church with this kind of model. So maybe next slide. Like if you're just a church that has been influenced by the 70s, 80s praise and worship model, where your model is basically praise, fast songs and enter His gates with thanksgiving, and then worship, we bow down and more intimate stuff. Is there a way to construe the praise and worship model inside this paradigm that allows us to be more faithful to the biblical tradition? I think there is. I think there is. That part of that intimacy of moving closer to God means, and what's funny is you read John Wimber's early stuff, because John Wimber wrote about this, and one of the things that, actually, if you go to the next slide, maybe. Yeah, so this is more of a typical John Wimber vineyard style understanding. Invitation, engagement, exaltation, and adoration and giving. And what he would say about that exaltation time, where it's like you're getting more intimate with God, he would sometimes speak about the need of confession there. He would speak about these things that, well, honestly, if you're being honest in the presence of the Lord, you naturally encounter. Unless you're sort of sidelining your sin and thinking that God's just a teddy bear without any sense of holiness, which, I think if God's really showing up, you're going to feel some of these things, right? And so I think it works in a vineyard model too, and then even allows for post-sermon ministry time. If you are charismatic, and if you really want that time for gifts to be manifested and gifts to be utilized to bless and serve, that's kind of the mission of the church happening on the back end. So feels like it fits there. And then if you go to the next slide, I think of more in churches nowadays that are, this is more of a traditional, so like prayer book. This is very prayer book-ish and sort of historic Christian liturgy. And what I've tried to do when I've gone into these kind of contexts is when you worship through a prayer book liturgy or something that's very wordy, you lose the forest for the trees. Like you lose the big flow. Like that, I think that accusation holds. Like you lose a sense of where you're going. And what I've tried to do in those contexts is help us understand in all these different elements, how are we being led? What's happening in this moment? How do we think about our connection with the Lord here? What is it about the flow here? And so usually these historic liturgies are divided up in a two-part liturgy, liturgy of the word and liturgy of the upper room. So it's kind of scriptures and preaching and then communion. And I like to think of them as sort of two movements of that arc. And then, is there one more there? Yeah, so this is one that I've seen a lot of people employ who wants to kind of engage liturgical elements but not wholesale like a prayer book, but value the big song set and want to intersperse those with prayers or with readings, creeds, things like that. And so this is kind of like a model that I see a lot of churches employing these days who value the tradition but also have a sort of modern worship kind of vineyard-tinged aesthetic placed upon them because of the sort of influence of contemporary worship and song sets and worship conferences and Bethel and all those kinds of things, So I'm trying to give a way forward that is at once faithful to tradition, but also honors what is truly gripping and powerful about these different traditions models for the way that they worship the Lord.
So lots of footnotes, graphs included, great bibliography. You see that Zach's not, prizing a particular style or tradition, but really trying to have a very broad conversation, which I appreciate. So in addition to all of these roles, the book remains very Christ-centered because the last chapter is worship pastor as failure, which I'll leave, not have you discuss just yet, but hopefully that's tantalizing for some book sales. But would you be willing to come and join us?
Sure. And
so
you're
Brent,
introducing me at the time where you're talking about worship leader as failure.
Speaking of failures,
yeah, I'm happy to come.
What a great segue. We were talking about vaudeville a little bit ago. Anyways, Brad Coleman, campus pastor of Christ Church Highland Park, is an artist himself, worship leader for many years, liturgical architect. You can put that on the business card now.
It's on.
Yeah. So I'll just give you anything you want to comment on, or any thoughts you're having right now. Just give it the floor to you.
Sure. I think just in response to the basic thesis of worship leader as pastor, shepherd. I think I often think about Paul's prayer in Ephesians 3, where he prays that we would know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. And I often, I loved that phrase for a long time, that we would know something that surpasses knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And when I as a young Christian, when I came across that prayer, I thought, well, that means because the love of God is so big that it's hard to wrap our arms around. It's hard to understand. But more recently, I've been thinking that it's actually, I think, it surpasses knowledge. It's like a different kind of knowing. It's beyond cognitive knowledge. Like what Paul is praying is that we would know the love of Christ in a different way than knowing about it cognitively. And having our minds transformed is a critical part of transformation. But it's not the whole person. And this idea that there's something that we need to know that's beyond the realm of knowledge. It's outside of, it's a different kind of knowing. It's like an experiential knowing, or a knowing that's like the philosopher Michael Polanyi calls a tacit knowledge. It's knowledge that is a soaking knowledge, or a foundational, it's a knowledge that seeps into us. So it's like language. Like right now I'm saying words to you and you're understanding those words, and I'm not even thinking about how I'm formulating them or how I'm formulating a sentence. You're not even thinking about how I'm doing that. You're just absorbing it right now. How did I learn how to do that? How did you learn how to do that? Well, we learned because we were in an environment where we soaked in language, and it seeped into us, and it seeped in at a foundational level. And so that's how I feel like worship and the delivery of the word work together in a service, is that the sermon is something that's delivered that we receive cognitively, and it's a part of the transformation of our mind. But there's other elements of the service, like what Jamie Smith talks about in his books, that happens in liturgy. That's a soaking knowledge. It's what happens in worship and in liturgy is that we soak in a particular heart disposition, and we learn things that we don't even realize that we're learning. Like you realize you're learning something when you're hearing a sermon.
Yeah.
But when you're soaking in a heart disposition, you're learning in a different way, something in a way that kind of is outside of the realm of cognitive knowledge. It's a soaking knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge that we receive that we don't understand even how we got it. And so I feel like that's harder for people to understand. And it's harder for people to look at the worship leader and say, oh, they're teaching me also right now. Because it's such a different kind of source of reception. It's coming at us in a different, it's not coming at us here, it's coming at us here. And that's what art does, right? Art enters into us. It doesn't enter in through the front door. Language, like what we're doing right now, is entering in through the front door. But art enters in through the back door. And sometimes that it's a different kind of learning, but as critical a kind of learning as learning that takes place through the front door.
Well, I hope we'll have time for a couple of questions from you guys, but I'll ask you both one more quick question as you guys think about things you might want to ask or comments you want to make. As you reflect on your own vocational journeys, what are, for our teaching and learning community, what's an insight, a bit of advice that you might share for those of us that are, we've got lots of musicians and worship leaders that help facilitate chapel and serve in local churches. How would you encourage these folks that might be captivated by the vision that you're portraying here of this grand vocation of this grand task embedded in the vocation of the worship?
I would encourage us to be lifelong learners. I had a seminary prof, and not everybody's wired to be seminary people, but you're kind of in an academic institution, so maybe it is that you all are. And he said this, he said, I'm a little discouraged when I walk into a pastor's library and the newest book on the copyright date on their shelf, the newest one was the year they graduated seminary. In other words, they're not reading any new books. They're not reading anything new. That's not That's not necessarily an advertisement to just read new theology. You should read old stuff, like C.S. Lewis encouraged us. But that held for me, is that we need to carve out space to be learning, and whatever that learning looks like, and to be listening and expanding. And for me, it's been the dynamic relationship between personal reflection and application in the local church. That's been the only thing that's kind of kept me alive. And kept me on what I like pastoral edge, I guess, and not complacent is that dialogue. And for me, there's our seasons. There are seasons where I'm like reading and processing. There are seasons where I'm kind of output, but I think that the input always needs to exceed output, or else something's going to crumble. And I've been around long enough to see that happen in people's lives. And we need more flowing into us than we put out of us. I think that's how God created us to be. Receptive is what Luther called the vita passiva, the passive or receptive life.
I think that there's a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Trellis and the Vine, which I think the best part of that book is the title. I think it's a good book and a helpful book, but I love the image. And the idea of the book is that the church needs both a trellis and a vine. The trellis is a structure that holds up the life of the vine and allows the vine to be healthy and allows it to grow in a healthy way. But the life is not in the trellis. The trellis is necessary so that the vine can have life in it in a healthy way. But the life is in the vine, right? Like where the life is coursing through and flowing through is the vine. And as a worship leader, I've thought about that same illustration with the music being the trellis for the worship leader. And for some churches, they create a really beautiful trellis. Right? Their entire focus is on the trellis, and they create this gorgeous trellis, but there's no life in it. And as a worship pastor, I think we can tend to focus on the trellis, which is the structure of the life of the worship pastor, which is spiritual formation and spiritual transformation and developing the loves and desires in the hearts of our congregation and shepherding them and pastoring them. And so both are necessary. There needs to be a beautiful, strong, structurally sound trellis in the structure of our services, in the development of our liturgy. And but to what end? The end is so that rivers of living water will flow through the people of the congregation. And so, I mean, one encouragement I would have is that I've started to read the book, and I love the ideas in the book, and I would really recommend it. I think really starting to view yourself as a shepherd and a pastor. If you're moving toward worship ministry, recognize that it's going to be important for you to develop in the skill to be able to create a strong trellis that will support your work as a pastor. But your spiritual life, the life of Jesus overflowing in you, and recognizing that your role with the congregation, like I said, the congregation looks at the pastor and they get what they're doing in terms of their spiritual growth. They look at the worship leader and they don't get that as quickly. But you need to, right? You need to step into that recognizing this is my role. I am tending to the loves and desires and spiritual imagination of this congregation developing and so stepping into pastoral roles with them, speaking into their lives words of life as a pastor would. I mean, just stepping into that authority, because it's a calling and an authority that you're moving toward. And so don't get caught up in what the congregation has a hard time understanding. You step into it with, with authority and recognition that you're involved in that kind of spiritual building and transformation.
Someone have a question, a comment, questions? Yes.
Zach, I've read your book, and I told you earlier, it's on my syllabus for the fall, my music and worship course, so thank you for that. I wonder if we could just briefly go back to the idea of shepherding emotions, and not so much what you did, your idea of shepherding that through a gospel-centered service is really phenomenal, pretty great. But I wonder if you can talk about emotional honesty, not throughout the service, but especially because I think most of us think worship equals music, but especially in our music event.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit? What our dangers are with emotional dishonesty, or?
Right. I think
that
depending
might
on your tradition, it would be an interesting PhD thesis to study the history of denominations and their relationship to emotionalism in the life of believers. Because it's almost like denominations, one could say it was theological issues that forged denominations. I happen to think it's probably some of this stuff that did. Especially if you look back to the Second Great Awakening, at least in a Presbyterian tradition, you had whole new Presbyterian denominations founding over how they responded to the revivals that were happening and whether or not they viewed them as good. And then you saw the trajectories of those denominations, even to the modern day, in the way they worship. If they were opposed to the Second Great Awakening, you can believe that their worship nowadays is very austere. They will have theologies that talk about it's internal and it's heart-based, it's not external and physical-based. And you'll see these things develop, right? And one of the things that kind of opened up for me after reading James K. Smith and after reading a guy named Robert Roberts at Baylor University, he's he's an ethical philosopher at Baylor who specializes in emotions and virtue. And one of the things that he's trying to say is that emotions are something to be cultivated as disciples. There's healthy, biblical, Christian emotion, and there's unhealthy. But because of our Second Great Awakening sort of reactionary views, we have various postures to whether that's the right way to view things. I mean, some of us think that emotions are simply something that are immature and need to be sort of shepherded out of us so that we're more emotionally controlled, people. And it's usually actually the non-white Western traditions that show us that that's bunk. Thank God for them, right? And so if emotions are something that can be shepherded in the life of a believer, and in fact, if my emotions are part and parcel to my discipleship, if somehow my growth is supposed to be in my emotional life, that I'm supposed to have emotionally healthy responses to various moments, joy. I should be really happy if something is joyful. I should be really sad if I'm confessing my sin. It's all about, it's not about avoiding or manipulating emotions, but the healthy Christian perspective is having the right emotions tethered to the right theological moment. And so what I try to say is if we've got this biblical narrative in a worship service of glory of God, gravity of sin, grandeur of grace, what we want to create a context where people can, if they so choose and if the Spirit so moves, experience faithful feelings in that moment. Experience joy when we're encountering the glory of God. But the reality is, too, that's the journey you hope people take. But not everybody's there. And so I think what you mean by emotional honesty is recognizing my goal as a shepherd is to walk you through this story again. Knowing that not everybody's going to be there, which is why on that graph earlier, at the beginning of the service, I often describe it as a point of emotional calibration. It's why we say, I could almost lead a song at the beginning of the service, the first song, and it could say whatever. It could be heresy, and no one would even notice. Because the first song's useless. Every worship leader knows your first song's useless. Nobody's paying attention to anything. They're just shell-shocked from their own life and coming in the door. And maybe they're shell-shocked from good things or bad things, but it's, we're emotionally charged people. And it's the acknowledgement of that, and it's an attempt to say, how do we How do we faithfully shepherd these things? And points, like we can't grab someone and make them feel, but we can provide context. We can say, there's the water. You know, that's where God would have us drink today. You know, and it's kind of leading sheep to water. It's their inner, the Holy Spirit, that would push them to thirst and actually, you know, go down and drink that water. But our job is to create the context for those faithful feelings. And I think there's a world difference between that and manipulation. I think that's shepherding.
I'm going to cut it off there, but you guys can hang out for a minute. Okay. So just as a reminder, if you need Chapel Credit, we can do that. We've got some books for sale. The Center for Transformational Churches is going to sponsor another similar event, this time focused on evangelism. But these guys are going to hang around for a minute if you've got other questions. But before we dismiss, let's show our appreciation for their time. Thank you for Thanks so much.
Welcome to the